October 1897. County Clare, Ireland. A village of 300 souls on the limestone flats north of Corofin. 7 children gone in 11 weeks. The official report called it river accidents. The local priest called it something older than the church. I arrived on the 14th of October with a constable's badge, a hand-drawn map, and instructions to close the matter quietly before it reached Dublin papers. By the 22nd, I knew the river had nothing to do with it. Subscribe for more true historical horror stories. My name is Edmund Cleary. I was 31 years old in the autumn of 1897, stationed out of Ennis as a constable with the Royal Irish Constabulary. 8 years on the job and nothing to show for it except a knowledge of how quietly people can suffer when they believe no one official is listening. I arrived in the village of Kilcavan on the 14th of October on the back of a supply cart because the driver going that direction owed a favour to my sergeant. It had rained for 4 days running. The village sat on a shelf of grey limestone above a shallow valley where 3 streams converged. The Burren country, a hard place. The rock came right up through the soil in the fields, and the farmers had learned centuries ago to build their walls from what the ground pushed up. There was a church, a public house called Tully's, 40-odd stone cottages, a schoolhouse, and a creamery that operated 6 days a week. The man I reported to was District Inspector Callahan, a stout man of 52 with a white moustache and the particular quality of stillness that comes from having made a decision before examining the facts. He met me outside Tully's and handed me a folder of notes before I had dismounted from the cart. "Drownings," he said. "River's deceptive this time of year. You'll confirm it and write it up and we'll be done before Christmas." He walked back inside without waiting for a response. I stood in the road with the folder and listened to the village. It was 3:30 in the afternoon, and there were no children anywhere. No sound of them. A village of 300 people on a school day afternoon, and not one child's voice carrying through the wet air. I noted that down on the first page of my notebook. Looking back now, I understand I should have turned around right there. The folder contained 7 names. Bridget Malone, age 9. Patrick Hurley, age 11. Siobhan Connolly, age 7. 4 more after them, spanning from August the 3rd to October the 9th. Each listed as presumed drowned in the Fergus tributary that ran a half-mile below the village. No bodies recovered. Callahan's notes attributed this to the current, which he described as particularly strong that season. I went to speak with Father Brennan that first evening. He was a small man, 60 years old, with a farmer's hands that looked wrong on a priest. He had been in Kilcavan for 2 years. He knew every family. He'd baptized every one of the missing children. He poured me tea without asking and sat across from his kitchen table and said nothing for a long time. "The river didn't take them," he said finally. I asked him what he thought did. He looked at the table. "There are caves under this land," he said. "Have been since before anyone can say. The limestone is hollow underneath, like a skull full of rooms. The old people had names for what lived in them. Names I won't say now." I wrote that down and thanked him for the tea. The next morning, I walked to the river. The Fergus tributary at that point was 11 feet wide, and in October, no deeper than a man's knee at its deepest channel. I waded it in my boots in 3 steps. The current was nothing. It could not have carried a dog, let alone 7 children over 11 weeks, without leaving a single body caught in the reeds downstream. I measured the depth with a stick. I walked the bank for 2 miles in each direction. I found one thing of note, a 1/4 mile upstream from where the Malone girl was last seen. A depression in the soft ground beside the water, not a footprint exactly, but a compression wider than a man's boot and longer, the edges not sharp but blurred, as if something had knelt or crouched there and then moved toward the limestone outcrop that rose from the bank. The rock there was marked gorges in the face of the stone. 3 parallel lines, 6 inches long, cut deep. I measured the marks, spaced roughly 2 inches apart, deeper at the top of each groove than at the base. I thought, standing there, that if I had to describe them to someone, I would say they were the marks of something very large, moving along rock in a direction that led away from the water and into the ground. I went back to Tully's and ate my dinner. I did not tell Callahan what I had found. Not yet. The village operated on a schedule of fear that had by October become normal to them. Children did not go out before full daylight. Children were inside by late afternoon, an hour before dark. Mothers did not explain this rule. They didn't have to. The children understood it in the way that children understand rules that come from something real and immediate rather than adult caution. The fathers went to the creamery and came home. The men drank at Tully's in the evenings and spoke carefully around the subject and drank more. The priest said the rosary every morning with whoever came, and the church was more full than it had been in years. I spent the second day talking to families. Michael Connolly was 38, a farmer, missing his daughter Shaban since September the 2nd. He had a habit of pressing his thumbnail into his palm while he talked, leaving white crescents in the skin. He told me Shaban had not gone near the river. She had been playing behind the family cottage, in the field that backed up to the limestone ridge. He showed me the field. It was 50 yards from the cottage back wall to the base of the ridge, a gentle slope of grey grass and flat, pale rock. I heard her singing, he said. I was in the byre. I came out 10 minutes later, and she was gone. I asked if he'd seen anything on the ridge. He pressed his thumb into his palm. There are holes up there, he said. In the rock. Always been holes. You can put your arm in and not feel the bottom. He looked at the ridge for a moment. I don't go up there now. I went up there that afternoon alone. The Burren limestone is not like mountain rock. It's flat and pale and ancient, and it comes up from the ground in great slabs, like the floor of something enormous that used to stand there. The cracks between the slabs, what the local people called grikes, ran deep. Some were narrow. Some were wide enough to drop a child into. I walked the ridge for 2 hours, and I counted 11 openings that led down into darkness I could not measure. Some smelled of nothing. 3 of them smelled of something. I could not name it at the time. Something animal. Something old, the way old buildings smell of old wood and stone, and the people who lived in them, except this was not people. It was the smell of something living in cold, wet rock for a very long time. I stood over one of the wider openings and held my lantern down into it, and the light did not reach the bottom. I reported to Callahan that evening. I told him the river theory was not supportable, and that I believed the children had gone into the cave system beneath the limestone ridge above the village. I told him I wanted a search party to descend. He looked at me for a long moment. "You are suggesting," he said, "that 7 children walked of their own accord into holes in the rock." I said I was not suggesting they had done it of their own accord. He told me to write my drowning report and submit it by the end of the week. I did not write the drowning report. Instead, on October the 17th, I went back to Father Brennan, and I asked him to tell me the names he had declined to give me 3 days prior. He sat with his farmer's hands flat on the table for a long time, Then he went to a shelf and took down a book, not a Bible, but a ledger, brown leather. The spine cracked. He set it between us. The previous parish priest kept this, he said, Father Cronin. He was here from 1841 to 1879, and his predecessor before him, Father Daly, from 1801. The ledger went back 96 years. It was not a parish record. It was a private account, written in two hands, of what the men of the cloth in Kilcavan had known and chosen not to speak of publicly. The first entry was dated February 1809, a child missing from a field beside the ridge. A second, in 1811, the ledger documented 31 children taken over 90 years in clusters, always autumn, always from the eastern fields nearest the ridge. Always without witness, never a body recovered. The names the old people had for what lived below were written in Irish in the margin of one page. I could not read Irish then. I can now, and I won't translate them here. What Father Brennan translated for me was the practical knowledge that had accumulated across those 90 years. It came in daylight. It came from below. It preferred the young because they fit the openings. It had never, in any recorded instance, been seen clearly. I asked him why nobody had told the constabulary. He looked at his hands. "What would you have done?" he said. I could not answer that honestly. So I said nothing. On October the 18th, I hired a guide. His name was Thomas Bagley, 54 years old. A farmer who had done surveying work for a land commission in the 1880s and knew the caves of the Burren better than anyone living in the district. He was a long, thin man with close-set eyes and a short grey beard, missing the last finger of his left hand from a farm accident years before. He had been waiting, I think, for someone official to ask. He brought rope. He brought 3 oil lamps. He brought a short iron bar he did not explain. He looked at my single lantern and uniform and said, "Take the coat off. You'll want to move." I left my coat on a fence post. We went in through an entrance on the eastern face of the ridge that Thomas said he had found 20 years prior and had not entered since. It was wide enough for a man to pass sideways, about 4 feet tall. The smell I had noted at the surface openings was stronger here, not overwhelming, persistent. Inside, the cave opened. That is the only way I know to describe it. You moved through a narrow passage for perhaps 30 feet, bent at the waist, and then the roof lifted and the walls pulled back, and you stood in something the size of a large barn, the ceiling 20 feet up, the floor of flat limestone with pools of shallow water reflecting the lamplight. Thomas moved without hesitation. He had brought a length of chalk and he made marks on the walls at each turning. We descended through 3 connected chambers over about 40 minutes. The temperature dropped with each chamber. By the third, my breath was visible. We did not speak below ground. Thomas had said that before we entered. He had said it simply, the way a man states a rule he knows will be tested and expects you to keep. I kept it. The silence of those caves was not empty. It had texture. In the 4th chamber, Thomas stopped. He held his lamp low and pointed at the floor. The floor of the 4th chamber was not bare limestone. Something had been in it, moving through it regularly, over a long time. The stone itself was worn smooth in a path that curved from the far end of the chamber toward a lower passage on the eastern wall. Worn smooth the way stone in a doorway is worn smooth, by passage. By repeated passage, by weight, applied consistently, over years I could not calculate. Thomas crouched. He held his lamp over the worn path and looked at me and pointed at the eastern passage. He held up 3 fingers and then pointed down 3 levels below. I understood him to mean. We did not go further that day. We came out of the cave in early afternoon and stood in the grey field and breathed. Thomas replaced the finger he was always replacing on his left hand, just moving it by habit to a more comfortable position. He looked at the ridge entrance we had come from, and then he looked at me. "There's more," he said. "Deeper rooms. I went in once in 1876. I came out." He left a space where the rest of that sentence should have been. I didn't go back. I asked what he saw in 1876. "Nothing," he said. I didn't see anything. He paused. But I heard it, and I smelled it, and I knew it knew I was there. On October the 19th, 3 things happened. The first was that I sent a written report to District Inspector Callahan requesting formal authority to organize a descent with ropes and additional manpower. He returned a written reply the same day by the hand of a constable who had written from Ennis. The reply instructed me in clear terms to cease my current line of inquiry and submit the drowning findings. It also informed me that a letter had already gone to Dublin recommending the matter be closed. The second thing was that a boy named Declan Burke, age 8, did not come in from the eastern field at the Connolly farm when his mother called him at 3:30. She found his cap on the ground 20 feet from the base of the ridge. The ground was soft from the rain, and there were marks going toward the ridge, not footprints. Compressions, parallel, evenly spaced, moving faster than a walk. The third thing was that Thomas Begley came to Tully's that evening and sat across from me with his hands flat on the table and said he would take me back in the following morning, all the way down. If I was willing to go, I was willing to go. I had no authority, no backup, and no rational explanation for why I believed what I believed. I went anyway. Because Declan Burke's cap was in my jacket pocket, and because the river had no current, and because Father Brennan's ledger went back 90 years, and because some things cannot be reported as drownings. When you have stood over the worn path in the 4th chamber and understood what wears stone smooth, we went in on the 20th of October before full light. 4 of us, myself, Thomas Begley, with his rope and iron bar, and 3 lamps. A young constable named Pierce, who had been stationed in Corofin, and who had asked to join after hearing of the Burke boys' disappearance. He was 22 and broad-shouldered, and he carried a constable's baton and a lamp. The 4th person was Michael Connolly, the farmer, Siobhan's father. I had not invited him. He was simply there when we arrived at the ridge entrance with a lantern and a look that made it clear he would not be persuaded to leave. I did not attempt to persuade him. We moved through the 4 chambers I had already seen. Thomas made his chalk marks. In the 4th chamber, Connolly stopped at the worn path and crouched over it the way I had, and I watched him understand it, and I watched his face change in the lamplight. He said nothing. He stood up and followed. Below the 4th chamber was a passage that required crawling for 20 feet. Then a 5th chamber, smaller than the 4th, with a ceiling perhaps 12 feet high. Then a descent on rope, Thomas going first, into a 6th chamber that we reached by dropping 6 feet onto a ledge and then another 4 onto the floor. The temperature was constant now, cold and wet and still. The 6th chamber was the largest we had entered. Thomas stopped us at the base of the rope with a raised hand. We held our lamps and looked. It was a natural room in the limestone, perhaps 100 feet across, with a domed ceiling I estimated at 30 feet. The floor was not bare. The floor had been, over time, shaped. Not by tools, not the way a man shapes a floor, but shaped by occupation, by something living in a space and wearing it to its preference. The center of the floor was slightly lower than the perimeter. The edges, where wall met floor, were smoothed, and the walls of the sixth chamber were marked. Not gouged, like the marks on the riverbank rock, marked deliberately. Parallel lines in groups, some vertical, some horizontal, covering sections of the wall at a height between 3 and 7 feet from the floor. Hundreds of groups. Some faded deep into the stone, some recent, the edges of the cuts still pale where the rock had not yet darkened with age. I held my lamp to the wall and looked at them and thought, only later, to count a section of them in a section of wall 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall. I counted 411 marks. Thomas touched my sleeve and directed my lamp toward the floor near the northern wall. There were objects there, not natural formations, objects, arranged a child's wooden clog, the leather worn off, a tin button that I recognized as the type sewn on school coats, a small crocheted square, the kind mothers made for children to carry as comfort items. There were other things. I will not enumerate them, but there were more than 7 objects. There were considerably more than 7. Connolly saw them before I could direct him away. I heard him make a sound I have not heard a man make before or since. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply made that sound, and then he was very quiet, and he remained that way. Young Pierce had positioned himself at the base of the rope with his baton in his hand, which was admirable but would not have helped anything. I made a note in my log at this point, crouching against the wall with my small notebook, 6th chamber, approximately 100 feet diameter. Signs of long habitation. Objects consistent with missing children. Multiple generations of markings on walls. Evidence of entity with significant spatial reasoning and behavioral repetition. I was writing this when Thomas put his hand on my shoulder. He was looking at the northern passage, the one that led deeper. He was not holding his lamp toward it. He was holding it down at his side, and he was very still. The stillness of a man who has learned through hard experience that movement draws attention. I looked at the northern passage. There were no eyes. I want to be precise about this because the accounts I have read of similar things always mention eyes. And I did not see eyes in the northern passage on the morning of October the 20th, 1897. What I saw was the cessation of a quality of darkness. The darkness in that passage had been uniform, and then it was not. There was a depth to it that was new, a differentiation, as if something that had been still had shifted its orientation. I am aware this sounds like nothing. At the time it was the most frightening thing I have ever experienced. Thomas had the iron bar in his hand. He was already moving toward the rope, not running, moving with deliberate control, and I followed, and Pierce followed, and Connolly followed. We went up the rope in order, and we did not look back at the passage, and we did not speak. We moved through the 5th chamber, and through the crawling passage, and through chambers 4, 3, 2, and 1 with increasing speed and no communication, and we came out of the cave entrance into cold, grey morning air, and I walked 12 feet onto the flat limestone. And then I stopped and stood there. With my hands on my knees, none of us spoke for several minutes. Connolly sat down on a flat rock and put his face in his hands, not weeping, just covering it. Pierce stood at the entrance with his baton, which was still in his hand, and stared at the ridge. Thomas leaned against the limestone wall and looked out at the valley below. After a while he said, very quietly, "It didn't follow. I asked him how he knew. "Because we're still talking about it," he said. On the 21st of October, I wrote my official report. It described a natural cave system beneath the limestone ridge east of the village. It described evidence of habitation by an unidentified large mammal of unknown species, consistent with the geological formation. It described the recovery of personal effects belonging to potentially missing persons, and recommended formal investigation by the appropriate scientific body. It recommended the area be restricted. I sent this to Callahan. He did not respond to it. I also wrote a second account, private, which I gave to Father Brennan in a sealed envelope with instructions to add it to his ledger. He took it without opening it. That evening, without planning to, the four of us who had gone into the cave found ourselves at Tully's. Connolly arrived last and sat at the end of the table and accepted a glass of whiskey and drank it. He looked at the table for a long time. "She's not there," he said finally, meaning his daughter. He meant her remains. "We had not found them. She's not in those rooms." Nobody answered him. We all knew what that meant. The cave went deeper than we had gone. On the morning of October the 22nd, I returned to the ridge alone, not to go in. I want to be clear about that. I went to look at the entrance in daylight without a task. The entrance was unchanged. The smell coming from it was stronger. I stood 6 feet back and observed. There was something at the threshold, laid precisely at the center of the entrance, where the stone lip met the grass, was a line of objects. 4 of them. A child's leather boot, cracked at the toe, a length of blue ribbon, a wooden button, a small knitted mitten. I stood there for a time, then I left, and I did not return to the ridge. I told Tomas what I had found that evening. He listened and nodded once, and then he said, "That's a message." I asked him, "What kind of message?" He looked at me with his close-set eyes and the expression of a man who had made his peace with a particular fact years ago. "Acknowledgement," he said. "We went in, we came out." It put those things at the door. He paused. "I think it's been waiting a long time for something official to know about it. On October the 24th, District Inspector Callahan arrived in Kilcavan with 2 additional constables and a letter from Dublin authorizing the formal closure of the missing children investigation. All 7 cases classified as accidental drowning, findings to be entered without amendment. He met me outside Tully's in the morning rain and told me my report had been reviewed and declined, and that I was to submit the drowning findings by noon or face formal disciplinary review. I submitted the drowning findings at 11:45. I was reassigned to a station in Limerick the following week. I was told this was a routine rotation. It may have been. Before I left Kilcavan, on the morning of October the 26th, I walked the village for the last time. The children were not outside. The mothers stood in cottage doorways and watched me from a distance. I stopped at the Connolly house, and Michael Connolly came to the door, and we stood on the step, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and neither of us had anything useful to say. So I shook his hand, and I walked back to the road, and I got on the cart to Ennis. The objects Callahan filed were lost in transit to Dublin, the evidence log noted. The cave system beneath the ridge was not surveyed. The eastern fields were subsequently absorbed into the estate of a land company that purchased the parish land in 1903 and left them fallow. No structure was built on them. The company's agricultural report cited the soil as unsuitable for cultivation due to the density of subsurface limestone formation. That is what the company's report said. I never went back to County Clare. I applied for a transfer to urban assignment in 1898 and spent the remainder of my career in Limerick City, where the ground is solid and the streets have names and nothing older than the Normans has left marks in the rock below the foundations. Connolly wrote me one letter in 1901. He told me the village had been quieter. No more children missing since 1898. He said the eastern fields were left alone now, even by the children of families who had moved in since. He said the old people attributed this to a boundary having been made clear. He closed the letter by saying he was well and working, and that he hoped I was also. He did not ask me to write back. I did not write back. The official record shows 7 accidental drownings: Kilcavan, County Clare, August through October 1897. The Fergus River tributary. No further incidents. That is what the record shows. I am 77 years old now. I am writing this in a small house in Limerick City, well back from the river, on solid ground. I have never spoken of this publicly. My children do not know. My grandchildren do not know. I have told myself for 46 years that this was the correct decision. People my age do not discuss things like this. The young do not believe things like this. That is fine. I am not trying to persuade anyone of anything. I am, trying to put down what I saw with accuracy before I am no longer able to do so. That seems important to me now. In a way, it did not seem important for most of my life. The entity that lived in those caves beneath Kilcavan is called, in the tradition of the Burren country, the Fear Dorcha, the Dark Presence. There are stories of it in the folklore of Clare going back to the 16th century. I know this because I spent some years, not many, but some, reading what I could find. The pattern the ledger showed, the clustering of incidents in autumn, the preference for the eastern exposure of the ridge, the territorial marking of the cave walls, all of it consistent across the centuries, the stories cover. The limestone of the Burren is hollow all the way down, deeper than any survey has gone. The old people knew this. They built their walls and farmed their fields and kept their children in at dusk, and they knew something lived beneath them that was older than they were, and that regarded the surface world as a hunting ground within a territory it had held long before the first house was built on the rock above it. We went in, we came out. It laid objects at the door. I don't know what that means, not with certainty. I know what Thomas thought it meant. I know what Father Brennan's ledger implied across 96 years. I know that the eastern fields of Kilcavan were left fallow for the rest of the century and into the next one, and that I have not heard of incidents there since Connolly's letter in 1901. And that, I do not know what that silence means either. Some territories were claimed before we drew maps of them. Some things have lived in the ground beneath this island since before the first people arrived on its shores and gave names to what they feared. The limestone always wins.